How about now? Oh my, I really don't need it, but welcome. My name is Corey Colleen. I'm the Executive Director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the Energy Forum, to our beautiful space in the Fisher Fine Arts Library, which, as you experience, we have some scaffolding and some fencing. I appreciate your tenacity in making your way up here today. And it's really nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience. So I'm looking very much forward to this event with our senior fellow, Danny Collinward, which is really going to present a case study in carbon markets. And if you know anything about California, you'll know that this is a pretty interesting test, right? If we want to talk about how carbon market policies are formed, how money kind of flows in and out of these markets, and then also how the accounting works, or I don't know, I don't want to preempt Danny, maybe he's going to speak about how the accounting doesn't work. But Danny really is the perfect person to have this conversation with today. So by means of a very brief introduction, Danny is an economist, he's a lawyer, he really works at the intersection of scientific integrity and climate policy. As I mentioned, he's a senior fellow here at the Kleinman Center. But he also is really interesting as an applied researcher because his focus is really on so many different kind of policy domains and contexts. So right now, he is the vice chair of California's Carbon Market Advisory Committee, a member of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's Independent Standards Board, and a member of the UN committee that this year was given a charge to really write the rules around carbon markets for the Paris Agreement. So a big job and something that he's been spending some time talking to us about this week. I also want to add that in addition to his many qualifications, Danny is just a really nice person and someone that we have had the privilege of spending some time with over the last several years. So I feel very, very lucky for that. I also have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Angela Pachon, who's going to moderate the conversation with you all today, who's been with the center now for over a decade, which is pretty crazy. And in her current role, she's helping us at the center build out a lot of our international programming and kind of a focus on international education, which is great. She is also an economist and spent her career before coming to Penn working in the international environment. So she was on the, she was a policy advisor for the Ontario Energy Board, and then also spent some time, a long time, with a London-based consulting firm that was working on electricity sector reform, and that work was all over the world. So she was working in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So she has both kind of an international perspective, but then has done a lot at the nation state level and at the subnational level. So you are in very capable hands with these two today. A little bit about the format. So Danny's gonna talk to us for a little while, and then Angela's gonna come up and moderate a bit of a conversation that she's prepared. And then while all of that is going on, I encourage you to be thinking about the questions that you may have, because there's going to be an opportunity for us to turn the microphones over to you and for you to pick Danny's brain as it will be. So I'm going to hand it over to Danny, and then Angela will come up, and I hope you enjoy yourselves.
It is just a privilege to be here. I look forward to my visits, and I just have to say, it's the most wonderful group of people here at the Kleinman Center. I'm honored to be part of this. I'm honored you all came to hear a little bit about California, and I do have to poke a little fun at Corey because we were debating who has the best parks in the world, and I think you're looking at it right now. This is a shot from my hometown in San Francisco on our beautiful summer day about a week ago. Our summer is just ending right now, and this is a picture of where I live. I'm going to talk to you about two carbon markets that are underway in California that are approaching a really critical juncture in terms of what's going on, that I hope will have some interesting lessons for both what's going on in the state, but are interesting to think about in the context of what other people are doing as well. As I get started here, let me make a very quick disclaimer once I can get the pointer to work, which doesn't appear to be working just yet. I am a member of the California Carbon Market Advisory Committee. I'm not talking on behalf of them. This is just me talking to you. And I also want to mention just a general issue that I encounter in climate policy. We have climate policy in California. We are affirmatively engaging in climate policy. I'm going to tell you some of the things that are not going so well. it's actually really important to understand what works and what doesn't work. And I share these reflections and this critical feedback in the spirit of making the world a better place, recognizing we need a whole lot more. And part of what's important is learning what's going on and what is and is not working. So to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, those of you who've heard from me earlier this week may have heard me mention some of my colleagues and friends whose work I've been relying on and learning from for many years, and I want to highlight 3 of them. And in particular, the work of my colleague Jess Green, who's a political scientist at the University of Toronto. She has a fantastic new book out this month called Existential Politics that is about the political economy of climate policy at a very high level. And I am going to plagiarize/summarize her book's message and take it around for a drive to show you how it works in California, where I think it's a very apt way of looking at some of the challenges. And one of the principal lessons Jess is teaching us is it's really hard to count tons. It is really hard to measure emissions, emission reductions, and removals accurately. It is much simpler and easier and often more effective to measure dollar flows. And the general theme of my talk is going to be, when you look at explicit climate policy systems, they're usually couched in the language of emissions and climate policy explicitly. The actual political economy, the actual function of the instruments, what works or doesn't work about them, is almost easier and better to diagnose by looking at dollar flows. And so that's what I'm going to try and do today, is sort of peek behind the curtain. I also want to acknowledge 2 other colleagues whose work has really influenced me and you'll be hearing about through the course of this talk. One is Lihi Yona, who's a law professor at Cornell Law School, and she's written a fantastic paper on how jurisdictions omit, and in her view intentionally omit, certain forms of emissions from their ledgers and accounting systems, a sort of myopic way of looking at things that reflect strategic priorities that are intentional. Her paper is called Emissions Omissions. And you'll hear in the course of my talk about how some of that's going on in California, and it's a really useful frame to think about these problems. And then finally, my colleague Emily Grubert, with whom I've done some work showing how some of these emissions accounting techniques can lead to really serious abuses. And I just wanted to call out these 3 colleagues because you'll be hearing about their work as I go, and because their work has really helped me become a better practitioner and researcher. So I'm going to talk about 2 markets. I'm going to talk quickly so we can get to the moderated discussion and Q&A. The 2 carbon markets in California, we have what's now called a cap and invest program. It used to be called cap and trade. It's a quantity-based program. It covers about 75% of the state's emissions across multiple sectors, including transportation, the utility system, and large industrial emitters. We also have what's called the low carbon fuel standard, which is a program limited to the transportation sector. It's an intensity-based program, which has some weird wonkiness, and it uses life cycle accounting methods, which I'll get into, are actually really easy to create problematic outcomes with, and I'll highlight a couple of those as we go. So let me start with the low carbon fuel standard. The low carbon fuel standard is one of 3 major elements of the state's decarbonization strategy. And in the original planning documents of the state, they reference these 3 strategies. It's a reduction in vehicle miles traveled, it's reducing tailpipe emissions through our tailpipe emission standards, and it's the low carbon fuel standard to decarbonize the fuels that we're using. Now, in practice, we're having big trouble with the first 2. We have essentially non-binding vehicle miles traveled regulations. We don't really regulate transportation particularly well. And we have a housing crisis that is part of the broader affordability issue. There is some progress on that front. There may be changes on that, but I'd suggest to you a lot of the issues in trying to reduce the amount of time people spend in their cars is about building homes where people live and work and want to be. And that's been a big challenge that the state is facing. We have historically in the state had ambitious tailpipe emission standards that do get federalized when there's an administration in power that wants to do that sort of thing. Those legal powers are now being challenged. It's a very complicated time for all of that. Those tools are not as robust as they used to be due to legal and political challenges. And on top of that, our electricity prices are going up substantially because we do a lot of wildfire insurance policies through our utility rate structure. It makes power very expensive. And so it's one of the few states where EVs are not necessarily always intrinsically cheaper when you think about the operating cost. The electricity is so expensive, it doesn't draw people in the way you might want to do it. But we do have this policy called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is designed to use a market-based mechanism to help decarbonize the transportation fuel sector. And I mention these challenges because this is one of the policy tools that we have unilateral political and legal control over, and how it works and what it does is really important, particularly as we're facing challenges in these other 2 areas. So how does it work? In a nutshell, it is very complicated. I'm going to give you the highest level summary. Imagine you had a special magical box that could assign a number, and that number represents the carbon intensity, the full life cycle emissions associated with every gallon of fuel in the world, every gallon that's sold in the state. We're going to assign a carbon intensity score to every single fuel that's sold, and we're going to set a target for how intense those emissions are. So how much emissions per unit of energy do you have? If you are selling a fuel in the state that has higher emissions than the target, you incur a deficit. If you sell a lower emissions fuel, you earn a credit. People who generate deficits are obligated to purchase credits to make themselves meet the targets. That's essentially how it works. Clean fuels get subsidies. Expensive fuels are required to be matched with clean fuels. Almost all the scores in the system are made through proprietary customized calculations. So I'll show you some figures. It gets really complicated quickly. This is a picture from the climate regulator, the California Air Resources Board, showing the adjusted carbon intensity scores of various liquid biofuels that are out there in the market. And you will see a huge range of scores. Gasoline scores about 100 grams of CO2 per megajoule. So if you're thinking about how relatively clean or dirty these fuels are, 100 is your benchmark for traditional fossil fuel gasoline. The policy target is shown in the black dots in the right. It's, as of 2024, it's in the upper 80s, mid-upper 80s. And you see a wide range of outcomes as basically every single fuel provider with a different fuel, a different source for their biofuel, a different type of biofuel, tends to get a customized score. It's kind of all over the map. But you can see the program recognizes these biofuels, from renewable diesel, biodiesel, to ethanol, as being significantly and sometimes substantially lower carbon than a fossil fuel-fired alternative, according to the life cycle calculations and methods of this program. So where does it come from? It's actually a very interesting program because it's never been explicitly authorized by statute. Most major policies, somebody passes a bill that says, do this policy. This is a policy that was authorized under General Climate Policy Authority, pursuant to a 2006 statute called Assembly Bill 32 and an executive order from the governor who passed that statute, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Early days, there was litigation from industry opponents. There were delays in implementation, but the program was upheld. There are these cuts in carbon intensity that are required, and in a fairly controversial rulemaking that concluded last fall, major cuts to align the ambition of the program with the state's carbon neutrality and net zero targets by 2045. There were substantial political drama issues associated with potential costs involved in the program, which I'll spend a lot of time talking about here. When the regulators' documents indicating what their cost expectations looked like became publicly noticed, the regulator delayed a vote on this and scheduled the vote to approve this in the few days after the presidential election, when you can imagine no one was paying much attention to obscure carbon accounting policies in Sacramento. There are now active lawsuits from environmental groups that have opposed the direction of this policy that are currently active in court. So, big sort of macro econ story of this program. The solid black line is the target, that carbon intensity target that's declining over time. So the state says, make sure the average carbon intensity of fuels is going down over time. And for the first few years of the program, people struggled to keep pace with the targets. It was difficult work. It was expected to be hard. It was expected to be relatively expensive. And then all of a sudden, we started exceeding compliance obligations by a substantial margin. You can see the green line dipping substantially below the policy targets. What's going on? It turns out what's going on is that there was a huge glut of credits entering the market as biofuel supplies that weren't necessarily expected came online sooner and faster than some people thought they would. Although market prices had escalated, and on the right-hand side you can see the price and volume transactions in the market, prices reached their maximum of almost a little over $200 a ton, which is a substantial carbon price with significant impacts. But as the glut of these extra credits came onto the market, prices crashed down to their current levels in the neighborhood of $50 to $60 per credit. And the reason why is actually really interesting and important from an energy system transitions perspective. So I'm showing here the volume of gasoline and diesel fuels, as well as their alternatives that are sold in the state. On the left, if you look at gasoline supply, you'll see it's mostly traditional gasoline. We have a special reformulated blend in the state, but it's the fossil stuff, it's the gray bars, it's all the conventional work. You see yellow bars representing ethanol. If anybody here is familiar with the transportation fuel sector, you know you can blend a little bit of ethanol into gasoline, but not a ton. There's a so-called blend wall, and we've been more or less at that blend wall at approximately 10% consistently. What really changed in the market was the advent and introduction of large volumes of what's called renewable diesel. So if you look on the right, you'll see the same yellow bars down at the bottom with biodiesel, which like ethanol, you can blend into conventional diesel, but only a little bit. Renewable diesel is chemically equivalent to traditional fossil diesel. So regular diesel engines can burn it at 100% purity without any implications for performance. And so what basically happened in the program is we have substantially overturned the source of the liquid fuels entering the trucking system, right? Our diesel fuels are now mostly made from biological products. You would not notice this in any meaningful way if you weren't paying close attention or had expertise in this, because it doesn't involve any equipment changing. It's simply a change in the upstream source of the fuels that are dispatched to serve the California market. There's a lot of problems with biofuels, though, and I think what's really striking is this was a policy born from a time when people were not optimistic about electrifying transport. They thought second-generation biofuels were right around the corner. Those biofuels are not really here in any meaningful way. What's happened instead is we figured out ways of manufacturing essentially biological diesel products from various sources. One of the most important accounting challenges has to do with what's called land use change emissions. So when you divert food and feed, things we eat or feed the animals we eat, into energy systems, you are, most people agree, creating consequences in the world that puts pressure on more agricultural conversion, potentially deforestation, depending on the crops that are involved. And my colleague Hannah Breitz from Arizona State University has written these magnificent papers documenting the use and development of this land use change calculation, which was first implemented in the low carbon fuel standard and a parallel federal program called the renewable fuel standard. These land use emissions are included to some extent, but they've been widely criticized as being substantially lower than the true land use impacts of diverting food into fuel. There's another curious element here, which is that most of these fuels that are being dispatched to serve California are created under a federal production mandate. So under federal law, they would be required to be made. They might be sold in Ohio or in Pennsylvania rather than California. But from an emissions perspective, you might argue they're not additional, because if this renewable diesel is in fact good or lower carbon than fossil alternatives, it would be produced and sold somewhere else in the absence of this program. So we're not actually causing new climate benefits. We're just paying to divert the production into the state. Biofuels are also massively inefficient. If you look at what it takes to produce useful energy through ethanol, for example, you get hundreds of times more energy by putting solar and using EVs for a given unit, an acre of land. But we are sort of doubling down on biofuel policy with this structure. And one really curious, I think, component of how this system works is, although the low carbon fuel standard assigns these life cycle carbon intensity scores to all fuels and tries to capture all of the elements the regulator thinks are relevant, the state's emissions accounting for its overall climate policy tracking purposes disregards biogenic carbon emissions. So this disappears actual emissions from our books. It has the practical effect of sort of eliminating and disappearing a significant chunk of emissions. My colleague Lihi Yona has written really excellently about this. And the last point, which I think really deserves to be mentioned, is that when you look at the life cycle calculations for land use change, the numbers show an improvement relative to fossil fuel emissions only if you include the effect of people consuming less food in the world. So when you divert food and feed to fuel, you increase agricultural prices, and modeling tells you people eat less. This is a fancy way of saying people go hungry because we put food in the tank. And if you correct for that, the modeling does not show a substantial benefit, and in many cases shows no benefit at all relative to fossil fuels. So I just wanted to call out, embedded in this accounting structure are some really strong, like substantial moral policy questions that get sort of ignored when it turns into these weird wonky numbers with bubble charts. One more accounting issue that I just can't let go of is this treatment of avoided methane emissions, primarily from dairy digesters. So you may know for large industrial animal producers, we have manure ponds where literally lagoons of manure is collected from large-scale animal cultivation operations, and that decomposes anaerobically, produces methane. It's a significant part, but by no means a majority of the methane emissions associated with ruminants like cows and also pigs. If you capture those emissions and create methane, capture methane from the lagoons by basically putting a trap over it and collecting and purifying it, you can create and upgrade biomethane into pipeline quality gas. And this program recognizes and gives credits not just for displacing fossil gas with a biological alternative, but for avoiding the methane emissions that are deemed to have occurred or would have occurred at that lagoon had it not been covered with a dairy digester. When you do the math on this, because of the assumptions the regulator makes about the carbon dioxide equivalents of methane emissions, you end up with substantially negative carbon intensities. So the scores assigned to these fuels say these are actually cleaning up the atmosphere as we go, which is a little controversial and counterintuitive. I see some folks who work on carbon removal. Normally negative numbers, we think of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. These are CO2e calculations that land negative because of weird accounting conventions. And these can distort, and were advocated for by a number of special interests to distort implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and many key policies. When you get negative numbers in emissions accounting systems, you can play very weird games to claim things are carbon neutral. My colleague Emily Gruber and I have written about this. I just wanted to call this out because we're putting something like almost 20% of the credits in this program go to these biomethane projects, which produce less than 1% of the state's transportation energy because this number is so negative. It looks so good on paper, but it delivers very little in the way of useful energy. All right, just trying to get this. Here we go. So where does the money go in this program? This is what I find so fascinating. When you cut through all the noise and you just say who gets the credits and what's going on the left-hand side of the figure, I'm showing in-state financial flows, and on the right-hand side, out-of-state financial flows. 75% of the money is going to biofuels, 25% to electrification-related activities, and the vast majority of it's going to out-of-state biofuel production pathways. So this is really weird when you think about a program that's imposing local domestic costs, but is largely paying for claimed emission reductions with out-of-state fuel pathways for industries that are not substantial political players in the state itself. I also want to talk about the cost impacts of the program because this is where I think some of the biggest challenges are going to lie. The basic economics of the program, I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides. I mentioned to you that gasoline has a carbon intensity of about 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule, and the program's targets drop steeply over time. As the program targets drop, that means every gallon of fuel that's sold incurs a greater deficit in terms of the number of credits per gallon that are required, so that as we move forward in time, we have to buy more credits per gallon to cover that deficit. If you look at the range of market prices that are allowed under this program design, the maximum ceiling price is a little over $250 per ton right now, and it grows at 5%. It's a pretty substantial growth pattern. And if you combine those two features, the exposure of the per gallon costs with potential market prices, you can get a range of gasoline price impacts that are substantial. And I want to be very clear, I'm not predicting what's going to happen. I don't know where credit prices are going to go, but this is the range of price impacts that you could expect in between prices being zero all the way up to their maximum level. And you can see market prices these price impacts were relatively low in the first decade of the program. Because we weren't asking terribly much in terms of reductions, even a high credit price was not leading to substantial consumer price impacts. But as the policy targets deepen, the potential for price impacts that exceed 50 cents or even $1 per gallon become very real, and I think are things we're going to need to think about. I'm showing here a LinkedIn post from one of the senior-most staff members of the climate regulator, which has generally disputed the notion that you could have any connection between this program and retail energy price impacts. And this is a figure that she shows and the regulator likes to show, where they've said, look, in the red line, that's LCFS credit prices, and in the blue line is retail energy prices for gasoline, and see, they're not the same. So everything's fine. And this is quite literally the official public position of the regulator about how to think about the economics of this program's impact. And this post happened to be responding to some work that I did for Kleinman that showed these cost calculations. I want to show you what the data say, because under state law, refiners are required to report to one of our energy agencies the cost pass-through of this program. And we have actual LCFS credit prices. So I have actual historical market prices, and I can show you what happened. And there's a fascinating little natural experiment that happened. When the regulator approved its policies at the end of last year, they technically were supposed to take effect in July. But it turns out many refining companies appear to have been passing along the costs of the higher program ambitions beginning in January. In May, the regulator said, oh my God, this is really wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. And they correct in June, and they apply the old numbers. And then in July, they start using the new numbers again. So it appears that refiners were passing along the high costs erroneously. They correct, and then the new numbers come in properly to effect in July. That's a natural experiment. And I'm going to show you what it looks like when you use the same formula. This is the same formula I used in my report. It's the same formula the regulator uses in its official analysis of the cost impacts of this program. I'm showing the reported data from refiners in black as to the cost impacts of the program. And you can see in January of 2025, they show a significant jump as the refiners appear to have been applying the more ambitious program rules in January rather than in July. In May, they're alerted to this phenomenon. They're said, don't do this. In June, they correct back. And in July, they go back up again. If you run the model with the lower ambition numbers in the program rules and the higher ambition numbers, shown with the higher ambition numbers in the solid orange line and the lower ambition numbers in the dotted line, it pretty well predicts the self-reported cost impacts that refiners are telling the state. In other words, the data that refiners are telling us about the cost impacts of the program are consistent with our ability to predict the cost impacts given a credit price. This should give us confidence when we look at the cost impacts of the program that we can predict what those cost impacts are going to be for a given credit price, because you can replicate that analysis in a backward-looking exercise. So unfortunately, the current public position is we don't really know how to calculate these cost impacts in an environment where we could be asking people to be paying a substantial amount of money, mostly for biofuels, mostly to out-of-state fuel production pathways, at a time when the state is struggling to address affordability as well as the equity implications of its desirable climate policy transition. What's going on here? We're doing carrots, not sticks. There's a lot of interest in dairy digesters. There's, to be perfectly honest, a revolving door between the agency. When people leave the agency, they often go work for the industries that receive these credits. We have refinery conversions inside the state that are supported by this program and therefore become political constituents that want to support ongoing credits to renewable diesel. And EV stakeholders who ultimately have the most interest in a program that's more targeted electrification rather than biofuels don't have any way to replace these lost funds, particularly in this environment. And I think it's fair to say we're not interested in rocking the boat too hard. Meanwhile, we're talking about moving to E15. So where are we on this program? Billions of dollars a year, mostly for out-of-state biofuels. Climate benefits are probably overstated. And essential investments in electrification, but probably not nearly enough. We have ongoing litigation, and we have retail price impacts that are already significant and are poised to grow much higher in the future. And meanwhile, one of the primary responses the state is considering to the cost issues in its transportation fuel market is to move to a 15% ethanol blend, in part because that would make this program cost a little bit less on the margin, but that's doubling down on ethanols and crop-based biofuels, which is not exactly what I would recommend from a climate policy point of view, but is sort of where we are. So that's case study number one. Case study number two is what we now call the Cap and Invest program, used to be called Cap and Trade. This is a program that originates from Assembly Bill 32 in 2006, showing Governor Schwarzenegger signing that bill. To make a very long story short, the state constitution now requires supermajority votes to extend any sort of program like this. And so the program was only initially authorized through 2020. It required a reauthorization that occurred first in 2017 that reauthorized it through 2030. And just this summer and fall, the program was reauthorized through 2045 with a pair of bills that extended the program, but I will suggest you ultimately did not resolve this question of where we want to land. So what I'm showing here is my attempt to make as straightforward as possible the following observation. This program has never been binding on emission reductions historically. What I'm showing you in this figure is the covered emissions in the program, shown in orange, that's the lower bar. The number of allowances that are made available for sale every year in the program, that's the light gray bar. We have a very large and generous forest offsets program in blue. And on top of that, dashed bars for extra reserve allowances that haven't been accessed but are available in the program. And what you can see in this figure is that every single year of the program's operation to date, covered emissions have been lower than the number of allowances and substantially lower than the number of allowances and offsets available to the market. It has never been binding. And that has been successful in some sense, in the sense that it's kept market prices low and therefore avoided concerns about affordability. But it prompted some significant criticism beginning almost a decade ago as people realized if you have slack caps, people will buy extra allowances, they'll keep prices low, and you'll shoot past your climate targets while people comply with the rules using the allowances they've saved up over time. It's a common issue that comes up in emissions trading programs. And it's resulted in a carbon price outcome where our statewide carbon price is actually quite modest. It's been at or near the price floor for most of its history, so around in the neighborhood of $20 per ton, so an order of magnitude smaller than the carbon prices I was showing you earlier from the low carbon fuel standard, and in a market that now has a price ceiling that's almost $95 a ton this year, substantially below the maximum levels that could be involved in the program in the future. The challenge that the state now faces with respect to this program, and it's very positive that they've reauthorized it from the standpoint of long-term credibility and moving forward and trying to both reduce emissions and provide stability, but we had a historical environment in which the program was designed, I think intentionally, to not be very binding, to produce low prices. We now have clear statutory direction that says design it to achieve our very ambitious 2045 carbon neutrality goals. And that's going to imply a substantial reduction in allowance budgets in the future for the program, which the regulator has publicly said this is their current intention. And that's going to move us from a condition of relative laxity, where we've had way more supply than demand historically, to conditions where we have a lot more demand and a lot more scarcity, and therefore likely higher prices as we move forward. How high and how fast, I'm not here to predict, but the overall structural force, I hope you can see we are flipping from laxity to scarcity, and that's the fundamental dynamic that will present challenges in the future. Very few people inside of the program system will talk about the likely price implications. It's complicated. Modeling is very difficult. The best work that's been done on this from a team of economists at UC Berkeley and UC Davis, published in the American Economic Review, it does a great job of illustrating how difficult it is to predict and analyze these prices. Some of the folks involved in that publication are also working for the state regulator and did release earlier in the process before reauthorization some potential outcomes for what would happen if the program was extended through 2045 and if it was reformed to address some of those historical surplus conditions that have kept us from achieving our near-term climate goals. And the sort of short answer from this modeling work is that they think in the near future we could be headed to much higher prices, potentially reaching the price ceiling, almost 4 times, a little over 3.5 times current prices by as soon as 2030. So there's good evidence to think we're not just talking about a little increase, but we could experience in the future substantially higher prices and higher price impacts sooner rather than later. So the reauthorization negotiations that concluded at the end of the summer gave strong authorization and clear direction to align these targets with the state's high ambition targets, but it's delegated most of the major market design choices, including the selection of those maximum prices, to the regulator with the exact same criteria that were used to justify the current approach. We'll see if they want to do anything with that. I guess I would be surprised if they take much action, but we don't know. It restores the regulator's ability to give free allowances to regulated emitters according to actual risks that the price impacts of this program will cause them to leave the state or to have emissions leak the state. Previously, they were required to over-allocate those allowances to the oil and gas industry specifically as part of a political compromise. It's going to shift a significant allocation decision. I'll walk through some slides showing how the allowance budgets are allocated in different ways. You can either sell allowances at auction or you can give them for free to different stakeholders. We give them for free to both electricity and natural gas utilities. The electric utilities are required to use them primarily to benefit their ratepayers. The gas utilities can do that a little, but not all the time. Beginning in 2031, all of those allocations are going to go just to electricity. So this program turns out to do a pretty good job protecting consumers from electric utility cost impacts. And in fact, because it's historically given more free allowances to the utilities than they need for compliance purposes, it's kind of net subsidizing the utility sector. And that's good from an affordability perspective, but we're not doing that for any of the other fuel sectors, including transportation fuels. So those cost impacts will sort of be borne without any compensation. There's some changes to the offsets program, but in the interest of time, I'll move on here. A couple of key questions that are going to come up in the regulatory process, which is set to begin imminently. Will CARB continue? Will the regulator continue to want to reduce allowances in the program going forward to address the fact that there were too many in the past? If they don't correct for that, we're not likely to be on track for our longer term climate goals. If we do correct for it, it's going to put more upward pressure on higher prices. Will the regulator keep the same ambitious price ceiling that's currently in the program regulations that was used the same statutory criteria to justify it? That implies a price ceiling that's substantially higher than today's prices. And how are they going to slice up the allowance budgets? Right now, we give about 15% of the allowances for free to large industrial emitters, 2/3 of which go to oil and gas emitters. About 40% go to the utilities, primarily for the benefit of their customers, and about 45% are auctioned and fund the state's climate investments, which is another key purpose that this program has. And as we think about this transition to really concentrating the benefits on electricity utility ratepayers, is doing good work to lower electricity costs a little bit on the margin? Is that going to answer political concerns around higher overall cost impacts? That's a key question that is essentially the political question that the state will face. So where does the money go in this program? It took a long time to crunch these numbers, but I was able to pull all the various data threads together. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing a percentage breakdown of how the allowances move in the program, just to give you a sense of how much in the orange is going to those utility transfer mechanisms that I've mentioned, how much in the sort of green at the top of the chart is going to auction, and how much goes in purple to the various industrial emitters who get allowances for free. The dark purple is oil and gas. This is mostly an oil and gas story. If you look at the value of all of these transfers, this program is moving on the order of $9 to $10 billion per year. very quietly in terms of who's getting the resources. The value to the utilities is in the range of $2 to $3 billion a year. The revenues that get raised for the state are in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 billion, and the free allowance allocations are a little bit over $1 billion a year. And that is potentially going to get a lot bigger as you look to the future of the program. So if you just take a couple of scenarios here, using the exact market design we have with that escalating price ceiling that's currently in place, you could end up seeing total allowance value in this program over the next 20 years ranging from ballpark 130 to over $310 billion. So these are wonky details. This is like a really dense set of regulations and debates that is going to move literally hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's why I advocate and constantly press for who's going to get the money and how do we look about how money flows. That turns out, I think, to be much more indicative of the politics and performance. It's really hard to explain this stuff to policymakers. I spent a lot of time trying to brief legislators, regulators, and their staff to try and get some basic information all together. And one of the things that I think is really hard for policy audiences to get their heads around is all of the things that we're talking about travel together. If you have higher carbon prices, you get the good with the bad. You get more emission reductions, you get more revenue, you get higher cost impacts, and vice versa. And I know to folks with an economics background, this is elementary. It is almost impossible to get a political and policy audience to see those are trade-offs. And you don't get the good parts without the bad parts, and you have to make choices about where you want to land. And I think one of the most challenging elements of this story is in part because we have, for more than 10 years in the state, had a program that had a really low carbon price, where people talked about these concerns, but the program was designed so that it never achieved a high carbon price. People don't think it's going to happen. If you say, wow, the program is going to be really different in the future, people say, yeah, we've heard that before for 10 years. And it makes me really nervous because the fundamental scarcity of what's implied by a net zero aligned trajectory here is really different than short authorizations with lax program design. But a lot of people are discounting the possibility that this market could move in ways that are very different than it has in the past. So why do I want to tell you all these stories? And it's just sort of to repeat some high-level things that I keep coming back to as I watch people implement these systems. Carbon markets are great. I got a lot of good things to say about carbon markets and the efficiency of market-based policies. I haven't focused on the good things here. I think it's really important to be aware of the downsides, especially politically, as people try and set up and manage sustainable programs that last in the long run. They have regressive incidence. It is ultimately kind of a consumption tax. And you can do things to make it more progressive or more equitable, like the electricity rebating structure that California has, which I think is really great. And we're doing it well in the electricity sector. We're not doing it in the transportation sector. That is essentially auctioning in the transportation sector is what funds the state climate revenues, which is great. But even when you have these good transfer mechanisms, the politics don't always work out very well. And the best example of this is up in Canada, where Mark Carney, the current prime minister, is a strong proponent of market-based climate policies, and literally his first course of action on entering office was to end the consumer elements of Canada's carbon taxation framework, which applied carbon prices to households in the transportation sector. It is really tough, even when you have a great policy like Canada had that had full revenue rebating, was very progressive, it was great economic policy, and it was a political firestorm. It attracted enormous controversy, and even with a good policy design, it didn't survive the politics. So my advice is set ambitious allowance caps, get yourself on the trajectory you want, and set a price ceiling that reflects the political balance you want to see. I have testified before the state legislature and said, hey, you could hit $90 or $100 a ton in the carbon market. When? I don't know. I'm not here to predict. The sky is not falling, but it's on the table. To which elected officials have told me that is alarmist propaganda. Do not talk like that. To which my response is, don't have that outcome possible in your market if you think it's scary to talk about it. If an outcome that is possible in your market is scary to talk about, that is a sign that you have not chosen a market design that is politically sustainable. If it is politically unacceptable to say you might experience an outcome that is allowed by the rules, that is a sign that you are not in a steady place. We are always going to have political limits on ambitions in climate policy, which means spending the money really wisely is important. I am fascinated that we have a biofuel subsidy structure that will cost like tens, possibly 50 cents a gallon in the near future, and nobody notices. I don't think people actually want that. And it's certainly not advancing the state's climate goals, but it is how we are spending our money. And at the end of the day, you're going to need sources of revenue that aren't just from carbon pricing. It's good, it's important, we should do it where it makes sense. I'm a big fan of getting it done. but it's likely going to be politically limited, in part because it's inherently somewhat regressive, at least to start with. And we may need to think about other sources of taxation, including progressive and corporate income taxes, to raise the scale of funds that are required for the big transitions that are ahead. And the last thing I want to say is to just sort of call out my friends whose work has been guiding my work in all of this. It is super easy to manipulate numbers, complex technical processes, to disappear emissions, to create favorable outcomes from one thing or another. Emissions accounting is as much political, maybe more political than technical in practice, and that's just a critical insight for policy-related research. That's my colleague Lihi Yona's, one of her main messages. Jess Green at Toronto is a big proponent of saying we are much better with governments and researchers at tracking dollars than flows of counterfactual emissions. And I think that's a really important insight to bring to policy analysis, although it's often opaque by design, in part to, I think, make it harder to figure out sometimes who's getting the money. But I think that's an important research priority to be able to cut through that. And the last thing to say, I haven't spent too much time on this, but some of these accounting choices can easily lead to the diversion of resources and propagate into other jurisdictions. Some of the questionable accounting choices on dairy digesters have been advocated to take over much more significant policies at the federal and at multiple state levels. So we need to pay really close attention to how people do all of this. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this was informative, and I look forward to a conversation with Angela and the rest of you. So thank you.
Okay, wow, that was such an interesting talk about, so a clear example of how, policies that are advancing, because normally we hear here is the lack of policies and how, the frustration of policymakers not being concerned about having any progress. But here is the opposite case. These are policies that are, that have been for a long time, trying to achieve this climate targets, and but having real consequences and side effects that perhaps at the beginning, they were not considered. So one of the questions is about these biofuels, because yes, there are a lot of externalities that you mentioned. At the same time, a policy like the one that California implemented has helped on the research and development of these technologies that perhaps the entire world is benefiting from. At the same time, it's becoming very problematic. So in your view, and how can we better address the emissions in transportation? We know that the EU is trying to address those emissions when they are passing reforms I think it's in 2027, when they want to implement and add the emissions from road, a CO2 price on emissions from transportation. So is that a better way to address the emissions in the transportation system?
So I think it's really complicated. Transportation is really hard, and I'm really struck that, again, this policy was born out of optimism that we were going to see pretty radical progress in biofuels that we have not seen, and I don't think is likely to be seen in the near future. Transportation is also really hard because there aren't a lot of alternatives, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a gasoline car, you get a hybrid, you can get an EV, that's kind of what you can do. The state's original planning, I think, is actually kind of shocking, because we spent all of our time in California on the places where we have policies and markets. But most of the tons in terms of reductions that are expected come from producing vehicle miles traveled. Now, there isn't really a strategy to how to implement that, but that is a housing question. That's a public transportation question. And you don't really get substantially different housing or transit options when you push the carbon price one way or another. You might get revenue that can be used to help support some of that, but the revenue scales are not there to fundamentally either pay for a huge volume of outcomes in either direction. Last thing to say, I showed you the figures on how dollars move in the LCFS. At the peak of the market in 2022, the amount of dollars moving to out-of-state biofuels would have been enough to do a full federal $7,500 tax rebate for every EV sold in the state. So that's what we chose to pay for instead of that. And I actually don't think EV rebates are the long-term answer at all. Just give you some sense of the financial flows and the opportunities. I think we got to look upstream because it really is where do we live and where do we work and how do we get around? And that a marginal price signal doesn't really move that needle, even though it's good and I support it and it's helpful. We just shouldn't put all of our eggs in that basket.
I see. At the same time, I mean, California is passing this reform, the second case, on that may make electricity prices higher in some way. And even though this, all the allowances, the credits goes to utilities now, but I mean, if you are considering having electric vehicles with such a high electricity prices, that's become also a reason, I mean, for not adoption or real, like the possibility of this being afforded by low-income, households. It's a challenge. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge. One of the things I think that the reform package does really well is it's going to concentrate the subsidies on the electric utility customers. So I feel very confident in saying we don't know exactly what the regulator will do with their allowance budgets, but if they do something kind of the same and shift the gas allowances to the electric utilities, which is the general direction of travel, we're going to have a situation where the electricity ratepayers are better off because of this program on the whole. Okay. That is not something we can say about any other sector. So I think the sort of affordability impacts are going to be much more pronounced in transportation. But if the state does a good job, as I hope it will, this is going to help address the affordability issue in electricity. But it's a small piece of the pie given the scale of the financial costs of the wildfire and other problems that are driving up electric rates in the state. And
how about productivity for the industry? Because we saw some, I mean, electricity prices for households may gonna be mitigated, but what about the rest? And is it gonna be a problem in terms of productivity?
Potentially. So most of the rebate, and again, they could revisit any of this, but most of the rebates have been concentrated on residential customers. And so that means commercial and industrial customers aren't seeing those same benefits. So that's a very fair point. Flip side is that the electricity sector is the sector where we're making the fastest progress. And so therefore the cost impacts of the carbon price will be more muted in that sector. So there's a perfectly legitimate set of issues, but I'm hopeful that won't be the thing that really stops progress or raises a problem to the level where we have to slow it down. I'm much more concerned about the transportation sector.
Okay. And one of the, I mean, in the first case of the low carbon fuel standards with the biofuels, the fact that they are produced out of state and those credits are all going to producers that are not even in state, or like you are not compensating, those revenues may not compensate anyone in state. Is that not a case to start to thinking about removal? Because I may think that these producers of these biofuels, they don't have, their lobby is not as important in the state legislature as they could be in Iowa or.
Yeah, and so I mean, the reason I bring up the in-state, out-of-state thing, it's crass. It's not like a good econ thing to do, but it's political science 101. It's who are your constituents. And I think the most important thing to say about this program is it's not a creature of statute. It's literally a regulatory program that doesn't have any explicit statutory guidance. So, I can't speak for exactly who calls who, but the question is, do those lobbyists influence the regulator, not the state? And I would not suggest that out-of-state agricultural interests are a major constituency in the legislature, but it's a lot easier for them to develop friendly relations with a regulator that's been pretty insulated from those politics.
Insulated?
I have used the word captured and will use the word capture again, yeah.
Oh, okay. But they are not publicly elected.
No, that's my point. And the sort of general thesis with California climate policy, this is very important. We have a massive oil industry that opposes climate policy, is very deft at trying to stop it. And the general idea was pass the authority to let a regulator take a bunch of actions, of which the low carbon fuel standard is one, and then try and insulate them because their bad people are going to come at them. We're now at a point where what I'm saying to you is considered bad people coming at them. And in fact, the deputy executive officer whose work I quoted recently went really ad hominem on a research colleague of mine, comparing her reviewing the peer-reviewed literature to the Trump administration's attacks on EPA and the endangerment finding, We're basically at a point where criticizing the regulator is portrayed as being an opponent of climate policy. And in those conditions where there's not a lot of political or intellectual feedback, it's really easy for things to drift in particular directions. And I think that's a big part of the story here is everybody's been kind of on autopilot and saying it's working. And I'm kind of warning that we're running at an iceberg.
Wow, we have this last week, and still, I think he's visiting Robert Habeck from Germany, and he was the vice chancellor, lost the election, and it was, I mean, one of the reasons was like it was not very popular, his mandate on heat pumps, especially because the affordability. And same happened in France when they tried to impose a gasoline tax with the Gilets jaunes movement. So, I mean, the affordability issue can at some point really, and its impact, obviously, voters and make a difference in elections. So do you think in California there is no concern when you see those cost impacts that the reform that the just passed, I mean, is showing?
I don't think people are taking it seriously yet. I think there's a flawed perception that it will continue to not be an issue. And I think, you know, as somebody who's very actively involved, I obviously have a bias in this, but I think there's a perception that people who are warning about this issue are doing it for the purposes of trying to undermine climate policy.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be clear when I said we're headed toward an iceberg. I don't mean the whole thing is bad and we should stop. I mean, we should turn the ship slightly to the right or to the left. And having a conversation about how to land that, I think there's a lot of potential to do this well and right, but you can't do that if you're on autopilot. And that's essentially the condition we're in. And I think that's reinforced politically because it hasn't been bad for the last 5 or 10 years. So clearly it won't be bad for the next 5 or 10 years. And that's a huge fallacy. But if you saw that, again, that price figure I showed you, where like, look, the credit prices go up, but the fuel prices don't change. So don't worry about it. That's the logic. And that's not a good way to deal with a complicated issue.
Okay, so we're just gonna have questions from the audience. So I see a hand raised there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much, Mr. Cullenward, for your brief synopsis of talking in tons, negotiating in dollars. I had a couple questions come to mind, maybe one that will take you a little bit more time to figure out. I haven't figured it out to the dollars and cents yet, but do you think that the discontinuation of EDTA has caused a difference in tons of carbon dioxide emissions?
EDTA, sorry, was that?
Yes, and canned foods recently discontinued.
I don't know anything about it, I'm sorry.
Okay. What about the effect that using a plant-based packaging like those available at places or companies, I think called Ecovative, do you think that'll have an impact on the trucking industry that's worth talking about tons of carbon dioxide emissions?
My guess would be that's more of a question of waste management than emissions, but a little outside my area as well, sorry.
Okay, and well,
Question?
what about the impact that automated trucking could have on the you mentioned a lot of biofuels. Do you think in combination would that merit a ton of carbon to talk about?
Yeah, people talk about automation. I would say it's not really going to change the total miles traveled, really. So it really comes back to the fuels and the engines. And so it's important, but I don't think it really moves the needle very much, would be my guess.
There's a question here.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Ishita. I'm a first-year MBA student here. My question to you is, one of your comments in the Q&A was about you don't get more housing or public transit changes by changing the carbon price, but then the last slide was about how everything goes together.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, what are the market mechanisms to influence public transit if that's not the carbon price?
Good Lord, I wish I had a great answer to you. And I want to be really clear, I maybe was too strong in that. What I'm trying to get at is when you look at the scale of the dollars required to build housing or to build major transit projects, there's not enough money in the system. It's $9 to $10 billion a year, all in on everything. You can maybe find a couple $100 million or $1 billion there for new priorities, especially if prices go up. What can you do with $500 million or $1 billion a year? A lot more than I can do, but in a state as large as California, that's really not a major fiscal change in terms of the amount of money we spend on highways or transit systems or housing. So Could it be a source for important new programs? Yes. Currently, several $100 million a year do go to support major transit systems, and I want to acknowledge and honor the importance of that. I was more trying to make the comment at scale. You're not going to raise enough money to be like, in the way that like we're worried about SEPTA here. You don't bail out SEPTA completely and replace all the lost funds that the system needs through a program like this. It might help, but it's not the final answer from a macro fiscal perspective. It's a great question.
First Shelley, then Bill.
Thanks, Danny. This is fascinating. I wanted to bring one other policy into the conversation that you didn't talk about, which is California's waiver and the zero electric emissions mandate, right? So I'm just curious, like, how does the ZEV mandate intersect with the LCFS? Am I getting that right? And like, what work is it doing that you see fall away if it falls away? And if it stays in place, doesn't the mandate sort of do the work that you were hoping would happen as sort of like arbitrage between electricity and fuels?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. So if California can enforce and enforces its zero emissions goals, we're going to require new sales to be all electric of light duty vehicles. I think it's 2035. So we're pushing hard on that, and that is good. It's under attack. I'm not following the exact precise legal description of what you would say today. Not good is the short answer. And I think California has the right legally to do all that, but it's under attack and there's legal uncertainty. The way it works in the market, and this is a really great question, I'd say two things. One is that sort of as a background condition in these markets, let me actually back up for a second. I see Susanna here. Like, you know, from the Berkeley kind of stuff, these markets, the demand depends on all the other policies in the world. So the ZEV policies are exogenously destroying, demand for credits because they're creating electric cars that are not deficit generators. So we don't need as many credits in the world as we deploy EVs. If that's happening, that's going to put lower pressure on credit prices. If it's not happening, it's going to put higher pressure on credit prices. And I've heard several people say, well, without it, these prices are going to spike. I don't think anybody really knows exactly how to think about it, but it's part of the complexity here. Your expectation about what's going to happen in the market depends on how fast you think EVs are going to be deployed. And one of the factors that strongly influences that is the success of the ZEV program and the waiver. So that is super complicated. The other element to this, some of the more like sophisticated pushbacks I've heard to the general thesis I gave you is, well, if you just zoom back out, eventually we're going to have all electric and we're not going to have these biofuels anymore because they will be deficit generators rather than credit generators if the carbon intensity target falls not to 80 or 85 grams per megajoule, but to 20. All of these biofuels will no longer make sense and we won't be buying them anymore. So eventually your problem is going to go away. And I think that's an important insight. Although I would add to that, how many billions do you want to pay for stuff that isn't working between now and then during very difficult times where every dollar counts? And I would argue it's not going to the right purposes. But it is true with these market structures, this one will eventually get rid of most of the biofuels problems on its own if you give it 20 years. And the success or failure and the cost implications in the market really do depend on the success or failure of the ZEV program. So they are tightly linked.
Bill?
Thanks, Danny. I'm gonna risk making you come and inhabit my academic world. Forgive me for doing so. But when you talked about these programs as a consumption tax, they're operating against another new consumption tax, namely the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed, that, as I understand, treat biofuel feedstocks differently than other energy imports, and therefore don't exempt them from tariffs. And so what I'm wondering is how those changes are interacting with the incentives that are being set here, where we're seeing a different, essentially, consumption tax that's particularly hitting biofuel feedstocks as opposed to the other energy sources in the model.
Lord, that is a good question. Let me give you two of my best attempts to answer that. One is, one of these, remember I told you there are refineries that are converting to make renewable diesel in the state because instead of paying money to make fossil fuels, they're going to earn money by making biofuels. One of them, during the permitting process, a statistic I heard from a trusted colleague was that they were planning to import 40% of Argentina's soy exports. So your tariff question matters a whole lot to that proposed supply chain. I don't know what they're up to now. The other thing is we are no longer exporting agricultural products to the world in the way we used to. So there is, in some sense, also a glut of potential feedstocks domestically. I don't know how to parse all of those dynamics, but the notion that trade policy is fundamentally restructuring the input stuff on the, the ag feedstock side is, yeah, I mean, 100%. And I don't know exactly how that plays out. That just adds to the complexity here. And it's like one more thing you'd have to get your head around to chart a course through the next couple of years. There you go.
Okay, I think we're getting to the end, and we thank you, everyone. I think Danny, this is have been very great presentation and also such interesting cases. So a round of applause for our speaker. And today is our last lecture in the Energy Forum. As you can see, it's under construction. But I mean, I hope you are following us and you're going to enjoy our coverage of COP in Brazil. The Kleinman Center will be there, and with some sort of pen delegation. You can just follow us on social media and stay current with expert insights and commentary. So thank you, and we'll see you in the next event.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.